Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Salton. I'm the Federal Campaigns Manager for League of Conservation Voters for New York LCV, for Conservation Voters PA, for New Jersey LCV, and for Maryland LCV. And this is our Mid-Atlantic Zoom webinar, Lunch and Learn, about the Inflation Reduction Act. There's a lot in this bill that we're going to get into, and that's been talked about in the media several times. And each time I've noticed when people talk about it, it's only a little piece of it because it's just such a massive bill with so many components ranging from healthcare to energy and environment. There are tax incentives and there are tax credits, and there are a lot of different details that we're going to get into this evening with our folks from National LCV and from each of the state affiliates. So I just want to thank everybody for joining. As people trickle in, I just want to let everyone know that this is going to be a very Q&A heavy program. We want to answer your questions about IRA. So if you do have any questions, please put them in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, so that way we can field them and try to answer them during the Q&A portion. We're going to be hearing from Congressman Frank Pallone, who is the floor manager for the Inflation Reduction Act. He sent a video welcoming us for this program. We'll then hear from each of the state leads from the 4 states, talking about all the work that they've done to get us here to this point. It's a very big deal, and we just want to observe what has been done so that way we know what we have to do to go forward. We'll then hear from Matthew Davis from National LCV, sort of run down the meat and potatoes of the bill, so that way we can really learn about the different provisions in it, so we can take advantage of those when they come up and how we can best utilize it to advance the clean energy economy. So without further ado, I think we can go and get started here.
Inviting me to speak with you. Hello, everyone. I'm New Jersey Congressman and House Energy and Commerce Committee Chairman Frank Pallone, and I want to thank the League of Conservation Voters for holding this workshop and inviting me to speak with you, to all of you, about the Inflation Reduction Act. Significant portions of the bill were written and negotiated by my committee in the House of Representatives. And the Inflation Reduction Act is really a momentous action to tackle the climate crisis and protect our communities from its devastating impacts, things like extreme temperatures, flooding, and wildfires that come from climate change. The new law makes unparalleled investments, $370 billion in climate action and environmental justice. And the law does a number of things I wanted to mention. First, it creates new clean jobs with labor and wage protections. It permanently lowers energy costs for families, especially those struggling to make ends meet. There are a lot more things it does. It invests in slashing legacy pollution for frontline communities that live near Superfund sites and ports. And it will be paid for by closing tax loopholes used by the wealthiest Americans and big corporations. At the next UN Climate Change Conference, which takes place in Egypt this November, this will be the first time a U.S. president will be able to attend the UN Climate Conference with significant support from the U.S. Congress. The Inflation Reduction Act will slash U.S. emissions 40% by the end of this decade. And I want to make you a promise that I will not stop until we reach the ultimate goal of net zero emissions no later than 2050. The League of Conservation Voters has been an invaluable partner in the effort to pass this historic legislation. In my home state, I greatly appreciate the strong relationship and collaboration with the New Jersey League of Conservation Voters. No matter whether you're in New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, or a part of the LCV team in our nation's capital, I just want to thank each of you for your support in seeing this bill across the finish line. So thank you again, and I hope you all enjoy today's workshop. This is Congressman Frank Pallone. Hello, everyone.
Okay, why don't we hear from Molly Parzan, the Executive Director of Conservation Voters of PA now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Matt, and thank you to Congressman Pallone for those remarks. I'm so excited to be here with you all to celebrate this tremendous accomplishment. It's so infrequently, at least speaking to you here from the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, that we get many environmental wins. And all of them are largely kind of hard fought and hard won, and my fellow Pennsylvanians on the call can attest to just how difficult it is to feel like we're making progress on these critical issues. And so for me personally and professionally, this is an incredibly exciting moment to be celebrating. I was honored, along with my fellow executive directors who worked on this project with me, to be able to be at the White House last week to celebrate this with President Biden and leaders from Congress. So, and I'm equally excited to be here virtually with all of you to do the same. So just a few words on what we did here in Pennsylvania. It was, this was a really big change for us working on a federal bill. This is the first time in history for CVPA that we worked across state lines and with our national partner LCV in a coordinated way to pass major federal environmental legislation. I'm really proud of that work. We worked across multiple teams at our organization and across every level to engage voters, to educate them and empower them to speak out on behalf of bold federal climate action. We worked with state and local elected officials and other advocacy groups to lift up their voices and explain in concrete, understandable, relatable terms how the Inflation Reduction Act would help improve people's lives. This campaign unfolded, as so many of you know, over the course of over a year and a half. And this work took a lot of different forms during that time. And I want to highlight just a couple of the particularly exciting parts. In partnership with our national organization in Washington, D.C., the League of Conservation Voters, we ran a canvas program in Congressional District 17 out in Western Pennsylvania, spending $500,000 aimed at talking to local residents and businesses about their support for climate action. We knocked on almost 40,000 doors and recruited hundreds of businesses and supporters alike to demonstrate their support for this legislation. If you'll remember, all the way back a year and a half ago, President Biden came to Pittsburgh to announce what was then known as Build Back Better. And we recognize the importance that places like Western Pennsylvania play in the transition to a clean energy economy. We also worked on earned media communications, op-eds, letters to the editor generated by so many of our fantastic volunteers talking about the important provisions in this legislation. And we hosted events like this across the state focused on federal climate change legislation, and they were attended by hundreds of Pennsylvanians. We did in-person events with local elected officials to generate ground-up support for this work. And we ran a massive digital and social media-based campaign that had impressions of almost 4 million views over the course of this campaign. I am so deeply proud to share all of that work with you, but I want to be clear that none of it would have happened without the support of folks like you on this call right now. We are only able to accomplish this because of the incredible groundswell of grassroots support, the calls and the emails and the texts and that you sent to your members of Congress, communicating that this was of the utmost importance was what got us to this moment. And your continued engagement on this is what's going to get us to the next step and the step after that in the fight for a clean energy future. So thank you so much to all of you. I'll throw it back to you, Matt.
Thank you so much. Up next, we have Marissa Olszewski from Maryland LCV to talk a little bit about Maryland's efforts to get the IRA passed.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Molly. Great words. Good afternoon. I am Marissa Olszewski. I'm the Environmental Policy Manager for Maryland League of Conservation Voters. And along with our conservation voter movement partners here in the Mid-Atlantic states, Maryland LCV has also engaged our membership and our state leadership in the effort to pass comprehensive climate legislation at the federal level. Our efforts included webinars, town halls, lobby meetings, member and partner engagement through emails and postcards, op-eds to local newspapers, and even a community art project in downtown Baltimore. Alongside our federal efforts, or our efforts to pass this federal climate action, Maryland LCV also continued our efforts to pass statewide climate legislation. These advocacy efforts this past year were successful, and in April, Maryland's General Assembly passed the most comprehensive and ambitious climate-oriented legislation to date. Called the Climate Solutions Now Act, it calls for a 60% reduction of state greenhouse gas emissions by 2031 and net zero emissions by 2045. As well as that, our CHISPA Maryland program was instrumental in passing critical environmental justice provisions and including important electric vehicle and school bus policies. These state successes added urgency to our federal action, and Maryland LCV reached out to our federal delegation this spring for a commitment to delivering federal support that would complement and aid in the implementation of our new statewide goals. And now we are grateful and proud to say that both of our senators and all but one of our Maryland representatives voted to pass the Inflation Reduction Act with its full suite of climate provisions that you'll hear about today. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you, Marissa. Next, we'll hear from Allison McLeod from New Jersey LCV to talk about all the great work that New Jersey did to get the IRA passed.
Hi, thanks, Matt, and good afternoon, everyone. There's so many people on this call, and it's exciting because we know it's so important to all of you, just like this legislation is so important to us here in New Jersey. My name is Allison McLeod. I'm the Public Policy Director for the New Jersey League of Conservation Voters, and I appreciate National putting this together for us to share this information with you all today. Here in New Jersey, as a coastal state, this is obviously near and dear to our heart for many reasons. We know that New Jersey is unfortunately warming more quickly than a lot of the rest of the country. And not only are our coasts rising, but the land is also sinking. So we're facing kind of double the inundation rate here. And for those of you that have seen Jersey Shore, you know what a huge economic and jobs driver that is in our economy as well. So we are so grateful to be taking these massive steps forward to help protect our environment and our economy for the future and for our future generations. And so we're also grateful to Chairman Pallone, who gave our welcome today, who is of course from New Jersey. So thank you all for the chance to speak to you a little bit about the work that New Jersey did. You know, like a lot of the other states have shared already, we worked really strategically across states because we know that flooding and climate impacts know no borders. So we did work together to get this passed. In New Jersey, we had over 30 events with targeted federal legislators really advocating, including 12 lobby meetings with our representatives specifically about reconciliation, Build Back Better, and then finally the Inflation Reduction Act. But we really couldn't have done it without you all, without our membership. You were the ones who were there at our multiple phone banking events, our text banking events, helping us write op-eds, letters to the editor, doing those really grassroots efforts to make that impact with our legislators, and getting this issue out in the press. And as voters, letting folks know that this was something that was really important to you and that you cared about. And that included a lot of digital actions. We had our digital ads had over 300,000 impressions to our constituents and to voters and the public, and you all generated hundreds posts on Facebook and thousands of digital actions and emails to members of Congress. And so we are also proud that both of our senators and our entire Democratic congressional delegation did support the Inflation Reduction Act and the provisions. But as folks have said, this is just the first step, and we're looking forward to continuing to work with you all on implementation and on additional climate protections and provisions in New Jersey and beyond. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much, Allison. Next up, we have Pat McClellan from New York LCV.
Hey, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining us today. As others have covered, so I'll be brief here so that I'm not repeating them, but we're very excited about the biggest climate bill that the United States has ever passed. We got here through a lot of intense advocacy and work. And on behalf of New York LCV, I want to thank all of our members who wrote to their legislators and turned out and made their voices heard, speaking up on behalf of this bill, especially with Senator Schumer, who as our home state senator, but also as the majority leader, was instrumental in negotiating this deal, which we're grateful for his leadership. We'll get into some more details in a little bit on what specifically this means for New York, but I wanted to kind of touch on some other folks had mentioned climate bills that they're working on in their states. New York in 2019 passed a bill called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which requires us to cut our emissions 85% by 2050 and offset the remainder so that we're a net zero carbon economy by 2050. And if you've been paying attention to some of the debates that have gone on since then about how we're implementing that law, the big question that people come back to again and again is, how are we going to pay for this? How are we going to pay for this? And the Inflation Reduction Act is a big part of that answer now, because when you look at, how are we going to deploy new heat pumps and energy efficiency projects in people's homes? How are we going to get more electric vehicles on the road? How are we going to accelerate the deployment of clean energy so that we can achieve our goals of 100% clean energy in New York State by 2040? The IRA makes all of those and a lot of other things that we'll get into later a lot easier to achieve. So we're really thrilled that this passed. And again, wanted to say thank you to all of our members and everyone watching who helped make this happen.
Thank you so much, Pat. Okay, now we're going to launch into the main portion of the program. We're running into a little bit of technical difficulty getting Matthew Davis on, so I can get us started by going into that presentation. Okay. So here we are. The Inflation Reduction Act is literally the boldest piece of climate legislation that we have ever had in the United States, or frankly, that we have had, period. So what is it? It's a big piece of legislation. It incorporates clean energy, transportation, buildings, agriculture, healthy communities, clean manufacturing, public lands and waters, everything that we need to essentially transition to a clean energy economy and to decarbonize the grid. So what's in it? Quick summary of benefits. There is a lot here, and that the current modeling with this bill will help us achieve roughly 40% of our emission reductions by 2030. And we can do more to get to President Biden's goal of 50% reductions by that time. But the really impressive thing here is that we reduce emissions by about 1 gigaton of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030, which is just completely unprecedented. This is done through a mix of federal administrative action, a lot through the tax code, the federal tax code, and then working with our state and local policies to get us to this 50% reduction goal that we have. So a lot of this is done on the individual level, on the community level. And I like to think of this bill as democracy itself. It's allowing people to take possession of that clean energy economy that we want to build. And that's why this bill will help people save money on the household level, on the business level, with energy costs to transition to a carbon-free economy. One of the criticisms that we have so far about transitioning is that it's too expensive and it leaves workers behind. And that's the point of this bill as well. It will create up to 9 million new jobs, and these will be good union paying jobs with prevailing wages because of provisions in this bill. 40% of the benefits will go to disadvantaged, low wealth, and communities that are historically burdened with fossil fuel harm already. And because of this bill, the amount of reduced air pollution will prevent 3,900 rather premature deaths and 100,000 asthma attacks yearly by 2030. And all while reducing the deficit. It's the Inflation Reduction Act. It will drive down inflation and reduce the deficit, all while creating a fair tax code. So here are some of the numbers about the goal. As you can see here, the current policy, we would have a 24 to 35% reduction based on what we're doing right now. This will drastically reduce our expected emissions because of these historic investments. So let's start with clean energy because that's the real meat here. We want to reduce the amount of greenhouse gas we are emitting into the atmosphere. So we have to start transitioning how we produce energy. So that starts with tax incentives. These tax incentives will be 10-year extensions of what we already have and beyond that. And there will be tax incentives for those who do have the tax base for these large wind and solar projects that they'll get these tax credits. And what's really great is that for these smaller organizations that want to put wind and solar on that are under a gigawatt or from nonprofit or co-ops or municipal governments, they'll actually get direct pay because they don't have the necessary tax base to get those tax incentives. So this is a pro-growth sort of bill where we are drastically incentivizing people to get renewables online. And not just online, but also storage. And we want to get those in place to help these communities so that way we can have more grid reliability. And that's why it's additional incentives of 10% for new renewable energy projects as well. There's going to be a $27 billion greenhouse gas reduction fund, which will be private investment to get those emissions down in these communities where they have been disproportionately burdened with the brunt of fossil fuel infrastructure and the worst health impacts as a result of that. We're also, a lot of this bill is about money and it's about incentives, but it's also about standards. One of those is the methane emissions reduction program, which will make it so that you are penalized for having methanes be produced and leaking from facilities and pipelines and things like that. Methane that's not even being used for burning for energy, but this will crack down on the laziness or the incompetencies that result in so much methane being released into the atmosphere, which is so much more potent than carbon dioxide. And this bill also attempts to help out rural co-ops, and it has money for loans for programs to reduce power plant emissions and to encourage the transition to clean energy, renewable energy. Now, unfortunately, the bill also gives a lot of incentives toward carbon capture and sequestration at power plants, which, while can reduce the amount of carbon entering the atmosphere, it also somewhat incentivizes for fossil fuels to stay online. So a lot of good about getting green energy online, and then also some to reduce that amount of carbon from existing fossil fuel plants. So transportation now actually makes up the biggest chunk of our greenhouse gas emissions by sector. It used to be energy production, but it has steadily come down. So transportation is still the highest there. Now, the big ticket item here is electric vehicle tax credits. I'm sure you've read about it in the news, and it's the one that a lot of people are hearing about. So what exactly is it? It's up to $7,500 based on manufacturing and battery assembly, but up to $7,500 for all vehicles under a certain MSRP limit. Right now, that tax credit is in place, but there was a production cap on that of 200,000 vehicles produced. So a lot of the brands and you're familiar with, like Tesla and Toyota and GM, have already produced out of this tax credit. So if you were to get one before this bill of any of those makes, really any electric car that's not the higher end, more luxury brand, you probably wouldn't be able to get that because they already made more than 200,000 electric vehicles. But now they're getting rid of the cap, so it applies to all vehicles with the necessary manufacturing criteria. The other exciting thing is that for the first time, used cars also will now apply for $4,000 because the used car market is so hot right now. And because so many people, I think it's 2/3 of Americans, don't actually buy new cars, they buy used cars. I also bought a used car. And now we can also get credits for those too, that EVs are starting to appear on the used car market. The other thing it does is there are incentives not only to buy electric cars, not only for consumers, but also for businesses, but also to produce them here. We're going to incentivize them to do the manufacturers to produce in the United States. We're already going that route, and now it'll just be an additional boost to build things in America, which will also help reduce supply chain constraints, and it will help boost our manufacturing sector with good paying union jobs. But because we still want trade policy with this, it's $3 billion in investment in clean ports. It's looking into sustainable aviation fuels. And it's $2 billion in grants to cover for everything else. Sorry about that.
Matt, I'm now on, if you can hear me.
Perfect. And now we have Matthew Davis, who is actually presenting on this.
Matt, you were doing better than I could ever hope for. So you're doing great. Now, here's the thing. I don't know that I'm able to share my screen, or I don't. It doesn't look like I have that capability. And
do you want me to run through the presentation and you can just go? Okay.
Yeah, it can just be my audio. And apologies again that I'm not able to be on camera. Zoom has some very finicky features that I've never run up against until today. So apologies in advance, and thank you, Matt, for doing such a wonderful job running through these slides. And thank you as well to our state partners who sponsored this webinar, and all the members and activists who work with us and at LCV and our state partners who organized this webinar. We would not have been able to pass this bill without all of your work and all of your help and all of your emails to your members of Congress and your calls to your members of Congress and your stopping them in the grocery store and putting those yard signs out and everything that everyone did. It all came together, and it's all because of the work of folks all across the country and in these states in particular. So thank you. Can't say that enough. So anyway, back to the presentation. Clean manufacturing is another section of the package that's really fantastic. I understand that folks can see the slides on the screen, and so I won't read through all of the different pieces, but I think the piece, I'll pick out two things that I think are really key. One of them is for the shifting of federal purchasing and procurement to procure the cleanest, least carbon emitting materials. So when it comes to building bridges or building buildings, that the federal government will, from here forward, use as much as possible, and there aren't requirements for this yet, but we're on that track, to use the cleanest steel possible, which means steel produced with emitting the least amount of carbon pollution and other pollutants. Flat glass, which are sort of those big panes of glass that you see in big office buildings, especially oftentimes, and concrete being the other sort of material that is most top of mind in terms of emissions footprint. That investment in Buy Clean and in shifting the government procurement process will be very, very important, because the federal government buys and supports states buying so much of the materials, the construction materials that are used, and it will help shift the landscape of the production of these materials, and I think really make a difference in terms of reducing our emissions from the industrial sector, which is it's a challenging sector to tackle. I will also highlight the $6 billion in transformational programs to help make that transition possible. So it can help facilities make their steel through electric processes and purchase that electricity from renewable sources, as opposed to using petcoke or other fossil fuels to generate the heat they need for steel manufacturing. So that there is both the incentive at the government level and the procurement process, and then the support to make it possible for these facilities that aren't quite there yet. Although there are some across the country that are, but this will help more of them be that lower energy intensity, that lower carbon footprint. Okay, we can go to the next slide. In buildings, I think that there's a good deal of funding, $1 billion for making affordable housing more water and energy efficient. There certainly are more projects than $1 billion can fund, but $1 billion is still a lot of funding for these improvements. And the changes in the tax incentives around buildings, and both making them more efficient and electrifying those buildings can make a really big difference for new buildings, major retrofits, both at the commercial level and the residential level, and also to some extent there's some support as well for public building upgrades. So if your town is looking to upgrade its town hall, or wherever the sort of seat of government is in your locality, those renovations or new buildings can be made in such a way that is reducing their footprint and energy use. Okay, you can go to the next one. The agricultural investments are also major and historic. The $21 billion that will flow to the U.S. Department of Agriculture over the next 10 years will basically go to programs that we already know are working to reduce climate emissions and to sequester carbon in agricultural lands, whether it's the Conservation Reserve Program or whether that's EQIP. These are longstanding programs at USDA that are effective, and having this additional funding will really make a difference. There's also, just last week, USDA announced an additional $1.8 billion, which is on top of $1 billion they'd already put out for climate smart agriculture hubs across the country. And these will be places where the innovative cutting edge practices can be fine-tuned, can be rolled out to farmers, all across the country from these hubs, because of course it's very regional in terms of what's the best practices, whether it's winter cover crops to help draw more carbon in and improve the soil health, whether it's using biochar, what have you. So there's a variety of different sort of practices that this will help advance, both get them into practice and also bring about sort of the next round of climate smart agriculture improvements. So anyway, I'm super excited about all of the pieces, but the agricultural stuff I think feel like doesn't get talked about a ton, but is very important. Yeah, thanks. The next slide here talks about the public lands and waters. This is the area where we see I would say the most or the biggest portions of the bill that we think are bad, that are potentially damaging, and we're really unfortunate that they had to be put in order to get Senator Manchin's vote to get this bill across the finish line. Still, we think that with these provisions in the bill, it still will deliver major emissions reductions. And so the chart that or the graph that Matt had showed earlier in the slides, that takes into account this continuation of business as usual oil and gas leasing, which we at LCV and our state affiliates, of course, too, have been fighting against. We don't believe we should be doing more oil and gas extraction on public lands. We need to be phasing out, and we have been calling on the Biden-Harris administration to have no new leasing, and we continue to do that. The passage of this bill will make that much more challenging to actually achieve, because it mandates a certain number of sales that had previously been either canceled or held up in court. And one of those actually just happened, I think it was last week or the week before. That's sale 257 in the Gulf. It was basically reinstating bids on a lease that had been held up in court. And that was mandated by the IRA, unfortunately. And then it also attempts to tie offshore wind leases with offshore oil and gas leases, and onshore renewable energy development with onshore oil and gas leases. We certainly will fight every step of the way to block these leases, to work with the administration to find workarounds, and to blunt their impacts. One thing that gives me hope in this area around these mandated leases, especially thinking of like offshore oil and gas leases for offshore wind, which I think especially folks in New Jersey and other places really see the value. New York as well. Many coastal states see major value in offshore wind, both in terms of developing this clean energy technology for population centers and manufacturing and all of that, but also in providing a renaissance for working ports, manufacturing jobs, offshore maritime jobs. And so these we would be very we would not want to see offshore wind not move forward. So we are now trying to work with the administration and lawyers to figure out what can we do, and what are the ways to blunt its impact. One of the things that gives me some hope is recent sales that happened under the Trump administration in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which we also opposed and have been fighting against for years, along with indigenous groups there and many others across the country. The lease did not get many bids. There were only, I think it was either 4 or 3 companies that bid on tracts of land to develop. All but one of those companies has since withdrawn their bids because of the major grassroots action and pressure put especially on banks and major oil companies to not be involved in oil and gas exploration in the Arctic. And the rinky-dink companies that applied really didn't have the ability to develop these areas and relinquished their bids and said, you know, we actually don't, we changed our mind. We don't want these projects. We don't want this land, and please take it back, federal government, and give us our money back. There is only one entity that still holds any area under that lease, and it's a state entity, a state of Alaska, that is not an oil and gas development entity. So anyway, that to me is one piece of evidence to show that a lease does not equal drilling. And so we will fight to make sure that this continuation of business as usual for oil and gas leasing does not end up in business as usual oil and gas drilling. So that will be a major fight. There are a number of things that are good in the public land space, including boosting the fees and royalties that companies pay for using the public estate for extracting resources. So that is some good, but a lot of bad, unfortunately, in this portion of the bill.
Okay, I think it is now time for question and answer. Thanks so much, Matthew, for a great presentation. We have a question here. What will be available for tree planting, landscape improvements, and or reforestation, sort of tying into what kind of what you were just talking about?
Yeah, so there are the agriculture related portion has $5 billion for forestry related programs. And if I'm remembering correctly, I believe half of that, so 2.5 billion, or maybe it's only 2 billion, which is still a very large number, is available for the urban forestry program that USDA runs. We're pretty excited about that. There are a lot of opportunities to help reduce urban heat islands, to provide nice shady parks where places were simply vacant lots previously, and by doing that, we are of course providing, I think, we are hopefully, if this is done right, improving access to green spaces and also reducing climate pollution in the air and the impacts as well.
Great. We have a state-specific question for New York, so if Pat could also be brought on the screen. Someone says they live in a historical building in Lower Manhattan that has been flooded a few times from Hurricane Irene and Sandy. We recently completed a major renovation to prevent another flood. Can we apply for a tax credit as a New York City co-op or any other grant to help us pay for this project?
I would have to take a closer look at the bill to see how resiliency projects are covered. But on the broader question of kind of climate related improvements to your building that you might be making, co-ops are eligible for credits. So, I think that's something that we're excited about with New York, that when you look at the housing supply, particularly I think in Manhattan, Brooklyn, and Queens, the number of co-ops that are often relatively smaller and do not always have a ton of financial reserves, but are going to have to make significant investments in resiliency, energy efficiency, and these types of things. Having these new tax credits in play is kind of an enormous weight off of our shoulders of answering a very important question of how do we pay for this. So I'm sorry that I don't have a specific answer on your case, but broadly speaking, the answer is yes.
Great. Let's see here. Someone's asking about the EV tax credits. They said that they heard that the EV tax credits will be refundable or tradable to car dealers starting in 2024. Is that true? And will the same apply for energy efficiency and heat pumps?
That's a great, I'll take that unless others would prefer, but that is a good question. It is true that that refundability and the transferability of the EV tax credit will mean that starting in 2024, if you are looking to purchase an EV at a dealership, and that EV qualifies for the tax credits, that you would be able to get it basically as a cash back rebate at point of sale, which is a big help for especially getting folks who aren't necessarily strictly in the market for electric vehicle, and maybe are looking at gas-powered vehicles as well, for the dealer to be able to say, well, and hey, if you buy this electric vehicle today, you get $7,500 back. That kind of can make a difference to folks looking at prices and considering what vehicle to purchase. The energy efficiency tax credits have a few different sort of setups. For my understanding, for residential energy efficiency work, I don't think that is refundable and transferable, so that it wouldn't have the same sort of setup. I believe, though, for the electrification and the purchasing of things like heat pumps, that they will be available through a rebate type program. And I'm not sure what the timeline is for that for setup. I do know that some of the tax credits that previously had not necessarily been, they basically had been unavailable to nonprofits, will be that way, and they will be refundable. And so, for example, say a nonprofit owned a building and they wanted to put solar panels on the roof. Previously, they wouldn't be eligible for a tax credit because they are not a taxable entity. They don't have taxable, mostly they don't have taxable income to offset with a credit. But now that community nonprofit with a building could put up that solar array and get that 30% credit as as a refundable credit back, so that they could take advantage of that incentive. So hopefully that explains most, as much as we can get into the detail today.
Great. Okay, we have another question from a Borough Council member in PA, Mandy Steele. The question is there money here for municipal solar and battery systems? So if Molly could also be brought on screen.
Well, I'm happy to take a first stab here, Molly, if you'd like. And this actually is, I think I was sort of answering this question before it was asked, or after it was asked in my last response. But municipalities, we believe, will be part of that ability to get tax credits as a refundable credit, whereas right now municipalities don't have taxes that they're paying to the IRS, and so wouldn't be able to take advantage of that. So I believe the answer is yes. It's possible that there will have to be some additional guidance or memos put out from the Treasury Department, from the IRS, to clarify sort of how that would work. And I don't think that it is spelled out in the bill itself, which I think which is understandable. But anyway, so there might be a little bit of lag time in terms of, you know, the coming months to look to see what guidance comes out on that specific question.
Great. Molly, did you have anything to add on that? Okay, all good. I want to throw it over to Allison from New Jersey. We got a question about electric vehicle charging infrastructure, and I think she has a better sense of what that question is than I do.
Sure, thanks. I know the question in particular, I just want to highlight was about New York, but New Jersey might be in the same boat. So Pat, if you want to jump in, please feel free. The question was about the recent NEVI planning for electric vehicle infrastructure. And the question was, why were some states included and other states weren't? Here in New Jersey, we're still working closely with both the administration, the NJDEP, their electric vehicle program, and the governor's office. They're accepting a lot of input from advocates on kind of the design of that program. So stay tuned. Just because some of the plans haven't been approved yet, it doesn't mean they're not participating. So you might see in the next coming weeks and months, some more states should be added, and you'll see the charging infrastructure plans coming out shortly. So stay tuned. But thanks for that question.
Great. We have a question. Which agency will the funds for affordable housing measures and the transformative industrial run through?
There are a few different agencies that will be involved in the industrial, the manufacturing, sort of clean manufacturing and industrial decarbonization. There are, I think the primary agency will likely, for many of those programs, is the Department of Energy. That said, there are some pieces that go through the Department of Commerce and also some at the Department of Labor. And Department of Labor, it's a little bit more on the sort of worker training and transition. When it comes to, I'm sorry, the first part of the question, the agricultural investments, was that the question?
It's about which agency do affordable housing.
Yes, sorry, housing.
Yeah.
That those will run through the housing and urban development HUD, and yeah, there are some funds through the infrastructure law that went to rural development, and there may be some crossover or some collaboration there between the rural development, which is a part of the USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, and HUD, but I think HUD will be the primary implementer there.
Mm-hmm. Great, and I think we have time for 2 more questions. So someone said, I appreciate the comments in the presentation about good paying union jobs. How can we ensure that these jobs make it to the energy impacted communities like rural Appalachia rather than being concentrated in urban areas?
That's a fantastic question. And there are provisions in the bill that focus those investments on energy impacted communities or fossil fuel impacted communities. So there are specific tax incentives, for example, for clean manufacturing that they have a set aside for communities that either have hosted a power plant or are neighboring to a power plant or are neighboring to a mine or a mine that's shut down. And it could be a power plant that's operating or a power plant that has shut down over a certain sort of recent history. And I can't remember the exact dates. But so that's just one way that the bill is directing those clean manufacturing incentives to those communities. The hope would be that in those, those standing up of manufacturing facilities and jobs, that some number of those jobs would be union jobs. There are requirements across the board pretty much that any of the jobs in the construction of the projects receiving the tax incentives, whether it's solar panels or wind turbines or electric vehicles, that and these clean manufacturing facilities would also qualify in terms of that, would be prevailing wage and would have a requirement for registered apprenticeship programs. Those registered apprenticeship programs, I think, phase in over the next couple of years, if I'm remembering correctly. And what that really helps with too is building in that that conveyor belt of good of workers being able to transition from whatever they were doing to what they're doing now. And I think is just a fantastic example of some of the wins for labor in the bill, in addition to requirements around domestic content for renewable energy development, which are an incentive at first and then become a requirement later in the later years as we move forward.
Great. And I think we have time for one final question. So this sort of sums it all up. Someone asks, how does the funding actually turn into projects? Are some categories actually tax credits and or other state grants? And for grants, will they go to states or directly to municipalities and local governments? Basically, how does this turn from legislation into actual projects?
This is a great question, and like you said, Matt, it does sort of sum it all up. So of the $370 billion, a large portion of that is investments through tax incentives. There are, so how those work is, a project developer puts forward and then develops a solar panels on a school roof or on a business roof. Let's make it business for this, for this example. That might have cost them, $200,000 to create. With a 30% tax incentive, they would then get, $60,000 back. Again, this is all just a hypothetical. Those jobs would have to be prevailing wage. If it's a big enough project, they have to be prevailing wage, and there has to be a registered apprenticeship program so that people are learning how to do these installs. They're learning how to become, licensed electricians, things like that, which helps build our workforce and provide those good jobs. There is a good portion of the bill that are grants that will flow to the states, where the states will run a grant making process to choose which projects get them. One of the portions, let's see, what's a good example of that? There are, well, I think trying to think. I think it's possible that the HUD money will work this way, but I don't know that for sure. But for example, if that were the case, it would flow to the state, public housing agency, and that they would run some process to figure out, okay, which projects to retrofit or build new public housing, affordable housing, and make them more energy efficient and water efficient would get additional incentives. And those would be, direct money. And then there's another set of investments, such as the $3 billion in environmental justice and climate justice grants. Those will be administered by the EPA at the federal level through their Office of Environmental Justice, and they will run a grant making process, review applications from across the country, and provide those grants directly to community organizations or localities. I can't remember exactly all of the who is eligible for those, but primarily for nonprofit community-based organizations doing work. But I think it's also possible that cities and localities would be able to apply. So anyway, that gives you just a sampling of kind of all of those things. All of the different incentives are captured within this big bill.
Great. Well, that actually wraps up the hour. So I just wanted to thank everybody who was involved in this, all the panelists. I want to thank Matthew Davis for being so kind and sparing us with the technical difficulties to give a great presentation. And again, it's just incredible that we had an hour, we talked about IRA, and we haven't even gotten into a lot of it. It's just so much. And really over the course of the next decade is going to be it rolling out, getting to state governments and local governments. And like that last question asked, how we go from the funding in the bill, just saying there it is, to it being reality. And I'm just so thankful for everyone who took their lunch break to come here. Hopefully you learned something. Thank you for all the questions. We didn't get a chance to get to all of them, but we will go on the go through them, and we'll try to answer them via email so that you can get some of those answers. And also there is a White House website that's relatively new. They set up specifically for the Inflation Reduction Act, where it goes through the different pieces of, are you eligible for this thing right now? When will you be eligible for this? They're trying very hard to communicate some of this difficult tax language and incentives and things like that. That will be included in the email follow-up. Sorry to all the people who couldn't make it on today because of Zoom difficulties, but we're recording this and we'll make sure that it's available for everyone who'd like to see it. So again, thank you to everyone for coming out, and see you next time. Bye. Thank you.